He understood laws couldn't accomplish everything. But he also knew that only the law could anchor change and set hearts and minds on a different course.
That was President Obama earlier this year praising President Lyndon Johnson as the nation prepares to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the landmark legislation that outlawed racial discrimination. But half a century later, my guest this week says that liberal policies and well-intentioned welfare programs are holding back Black Americans. Wall Street Journal editorial board member Jason Riley is author of the new book, Please Stop Helping Us: How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed. So, Jason, what policies are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about a lot of the Great Society programs that we're celebrating or marking the 50th anniversary of. I'm talking about anti-poverty programs. I'm talking about policies such as minimum wage laws, occupational licensing, and things like that. These are affirmative action is another one. These are laws that were intended to help. The intention was good and honorable and noble, but that's different from that doesn't make it white. It doesn't make it. It doesn't mean that the policies work just because the intentions behind them were good. Okay,
but what about the argument that you had a century of Jim Crow in much of the country, which was essentially legislated, government-enforced impoverishment, okay? Lack of access to the voting booth, lack of access to jobs, lack of access to public transportation. And to get over that and to help people escape that century of built-in bad behavior and government mismanagement, you needed something like the Great Society.
Well, what we needed was equal treatment under the law. We needed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those were needed. We got those. The problem is when the government tries to go beyond equal opportunity and ensure equal results. That's when you get into trouble. What I'm arguing is that black people must ultimately help themselves. They must develop the types of habits and attitudes and behavior that other groups have had to develop in order to succeed. And to the extent a government program gets in the way of that or hampers that self-development that must take place, it ultimately does more harm than good.
In a way, you are, and I think this is one of the most interesting things in your book, you're trying to resurrect an intellectual tradition that has really strong roots going back in American history. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, former slave, talked about escaping dependency, Booker T. Washington. Why has that tradition become so much less prominent inside the African intellectual community?
Well, I think the civil rights movement has become an industry. And it's a very lucrative industry. And what you've seen over the past 50 years is an attempt by the black elite to stay relevant. And what I try and get across in this book is that it's much more important for the black poor to have a man in the home than to have a man in the White House like they have today. And I think the Obama presidency shows that overwhelmingly is the case, that the things that ail the black community are not going to be solved by politicians. They're going to be solved by the black community getting its own act together internally. The family it's going to start with the family.
But if the results are as awful as you argue, why hasn't there been a revolt intellectually and then politically within the African American community itself?
Well, on the one hand, you have the history of segregation and who was on what side back then. A lot of people are still alive that lived under Jim Crow. So among older blacks, you're going to have that historical memory there. But I think there's also...
And that the government liberated them from Jim Crow.
Right. And the left has done an excellent job of convincing blacks that bigger government is better for them. And the Democrats are the party of bigger government. But I also think the Republican Party needs to do a better job of courting this vote, going into these communities. We see some politicians on the right doing that today, a Chris Christie, a Rand Paul, Paul Ryan. They are going into those communities, and there have been a few in the past. Jack Kemp comes to mind, but those are exceptions. They're not the rule. I mean, right now, and it's because Republicans believe they can still win elections without these voters. I don't think it's racial animus that's at work. It's very pragmatic. Time spent courting one group is time not spent courting another group. Right now, Republicans are worried about Hispanic voters and whether they need them to still win elections, but no such discussion is really happening about blacks. They don't feel they need black voters to win elections right now. When they do feel they need them, I believe you'll see more black outreach from Republicans.
All right, Jason Riley, thanks so much for being here. Good luck with the book.